Good afternoon. It's an honor to introduce our lunch keynote speaker, Mr. Benny Lee. Mr. Lee is an internationally known trainer and consultant known for preparing individuals to make successful transitions from incarceration into the community. He also works with communities to help them build their capacity to effectively receive individuals returning home following incarceration. Mr. Lee is a nonviolence trainer for the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, as well as a trainer for the Community Partnering for Peace Academy. He is the founder of the National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Formerly Incarcerated, a community-based organization supporting formerly incarcerated men and women to stabilize them as productive citizens. He is a community liaison and reentry specialist for TASK. He's received numerous awards for his work, including the Project Safe Neighborhoods Award from the U.S. Department of Justice and a National American Honors Recovery Award from the Johnson Institute for his work in providing innovative services to gang-affiliated individuals in the criminal justice system. He was given the Professional of the Year Award from the Illinois Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Professional Certification Association. He received his associate degree in mental health and substance abuse at Kennedy King College and went on to receive his bachelor's and master's degree at Northeastern. Mr. Lee will be talking to all of us today about his journey from being a leader with the Vice Lords Gang from Chicago to becoming incarcerated and being placed on death row before adopting a philosophy of nonviolence and becoming a nationally renowned leader in the field after leaving prison. He will be speaking to us about building a beloved community, a concept created originally by Dr. Martin Luther King, and the triangle of crime, as well as ways to disrupt and prevent violence. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Benny Lee. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Texas, Houston, Texas. I want to first thank this Public Health Department for choosing me to be one of the speakers here at this well put together conference here. I know it takes a lot of humbling, a lot of hanging in there to pull something like this off, because sometimes personalities get in front of principles, right? I want to thank one of my neighbors from Chicago, Danita, who called me and said, hey, we having this thing and I think you might be a perfect fit to come down here. But first of all, I want to also thank that there's a merciful God and a praying mother and a father I know in my heart that didn't give up on me, that I'm able to stand before you today. You know, my life, how do you work this clicker? Okay. Yeah, my life began when it comes to violence. You know, violence is something I guess you could say I was born into. You know, to hear my father knock my mother down and hear her cry, and being young, and it's nothing I can do, but there's this thing I want to do something, but there's this fear that he might dominate me. I remember thinking about going in his closet and getting his gun and blowing his head off, but then there was this fear that I'll kill my father, then how would my mother look at me, my siblings? And then this fear that suppose it don't work, he might kill me. You know, I remember moving into this community where it was a predominant other ethnic group presence. And we as young black kids had to fight to go to the nearest theater, the parks, to go swimming. We had to travel from 4700 West on Cicero, that's the strip I come from, off the road, to Columbus Park, which is 5500 West, just to travel through that community. We had to fight to get through there, then to fight to get in the pool, and then to get back. You know, it's Franz Fanon in his writings, The Wretches of the Earth. He talks about how you have a group of people that are oppressors, and they oppress a group. And the oppressed try all means of fighting back, but their means of fighting back are ineffective because the oppressor has all the tools, all the resources, and all the power, right, to keep them oppressed. But what happens, the oppressed start taking on the same tactics as the oppressor. And what happens, the oppressors moves out the picture, and then the oppressed start oppressing each other. And that was our situation, young black guys trying to just go swimming, find a place, have some fun and go to school, and up against these opposition of another ethnic group. And then when the community became a predominant black community, that led to black-on-black gangs. And I remember it was an older street gang in the community, the Vice Lords. This was in 1966. And they noticed us. And they say, well, who's your chief? We didn't see ourselves as a gang. We're just young guys trying to just go swimming, go to the, do what young kids do, because we was like in the 7th grade. And they say, well, if you're going to be in this area, you got to be Vice Lords. And it's going to be a nation meeting this Friday at the church, and you guys need to be there. We didn't see ourselves as a gang. We didn't have a name. So one of the brothers say, well, okay, Geronimo is an Apache warrior, and he's fighting a white man. Why don't we become Apaches? So we became Apache Vice Lords. So I became a Vice Lord and a Vice Lord Chief all in one day. Was I prepared for that? Nope. And as time went on, can I do it? Is this how I'm doing it? How do you make this clicker click? Trying to click. Oh, there you go. So at the age of 13, I became the chief of one of the branches of the Vice Lord Nation, the Apache Vice Lords. And that was a struggle, because I would try to be around the older Vice Lords, to get some credibility. And I remember one night I just turned 14, and they was about to go roll on some guys on the other end, and they said, man, here, you take the thumper, man, the pistol. I had never carried a pistol in my life, never shot anybody. And when they gave me that pistol, I knew they wasn't going to turn and say, hey, man, give us the thing and let us bust. They're going to turn around and say, man, up it and you bust. And say, I wasn't ready to shoot nobody. I never killed nobody. But I didn't have the courage to say, man, I don't want to go. Talking about this fear, right? But as the night went on, nothing happened. I was, thank God, nothing happened. But when we got back, they said, yeah, I told you Shorty got a lot of heart. He run that little group over there. But I was an imposter, because I was afraid. And that night at home, I was ashamed that I was afraid, because I'm stepping into a road that I was not cut out for. And the next morning, my homies, they like, man, damn, we saw you, we heard you was with Mook and Peanut, the man, they said you had the thump on you, man. I'm like, yeah, man. But I couldn't tell them that I was afraid, right? So I had to prove to myself that I'm cut for this here. So I started going against my own value system. Because, see, I grew up with a certain family culture value system, and I'm making this shift to a gang culture value system. You hear what I'm saying? See, but family told me to respect the elders, but now the gang say respect the chief. I had to make this culture shift. And so as a result, I ended up in a juvenile prison. This is me inside of a juvenile prison, IYC St. Charles, the same place where the Vice Lords was founded in 1957. So when I get down here, see, I've never been locked up. I remember going to, in 1968, we were like that largest group of blacks to graduate out the 8th grade. And we had to travel through this community to go to this all-white high school. Martin Luther King had just got assassinated April 4th, 1968. So racial tension was not just in our community, but it was nationwide. And I remember some guys came in the classroom on me to attack me, and just so happened 3 of my homies was coming down the hall, they got in it. But when it was all over, nothing happened to those guys, but me and the other black guys, we all got suspended. They said I was the ringleader. I ended up in juvenile court. The judge asked my parents if they want me to go to school. Of course, they said yes out of ignorance, and they didn't realize they was going to handcuff me, take me, and ship me to a juvenile maximum security prison. And I remember just as clear as day, my mother hollered so loud in that courtroom, "Where you going with my baby?" My father was helpless with his head down, and in my young mind, at 15 years old, I'm thinking my family don't want me. I'm treated wrong. I didn't do nothing but just defend myself. I'm talking about trauma. And when I got on that bus with those guys that had been in the Artie home, the juvenile detention center, and we drove to that Joliet juvenile maximum security joint, And I heard all the stories of guys getting molested and raped down here. And I made a vow in my cell that night. I would kill somebody before I let them molest me. I had to become something overnight. And when I come out of intake and I went to general population, some of my homies that was in the detention center had been talking about me, so my name got down there before I got down there. You know, the Blackstone Rangers then was one of the largest street gangs in Chicago from the south side. We from the west side. Their chief approached me in the gym and said, hey man, you want to box? I don't want no trouble. I want to go home. They said I can go to a camp and be home in 3 months. I don't want no problems, right? But my father always told me that if you show a guy you got some fear, give him more courage, right? So all you got is your rep. And he was pushing the issue. I said, well, okay, man, come on, let's go. We got the boxing. I realized he couldn't box. I folded him up like a napkin so quick, right? Then I just went crazy. Any other vice lords up in here, and they hurried up and shipped me out of there to St. Charles with all the rough guys that was there for robberies and all that kind of stuff. And I supposed to went to camp. And they had me to see Dr. Sapone, the same psychologist that treated Richard Speck, who killed 8 nurses back in the 60s. And they had me seeing him. And I'm still up against all this pressure with these guys from the south side down here. And my homies, they coming down here. And right, because we come from a strip ain't nobody heard of Cicero back in the 60s. So we building a name for ourselves. So those 3 months turned to 2 years. So I came out at 17, the world was different. When I left in the 60s, James Brown was singing, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. You know, the impression was singing, keep on pushing. You go to the show, Jim Brown talking about power to the people. People was wearing afros and dashikis. There was a lot of movements in the 60s. The Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, the Vietnam War. So when I come out in 71, James Brown wasn't singing Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud no more. Sly Stone was singing I Want to Take You Higher. The Temptations had a whole album, Psychedelic Shack, I Want to Take You on Cloud 9. You go to the movie theater, Superfly and the Mac was in the movies. People weren't wearing afros and dashikis no more. They were wearing permanent hairdos, Superfly hairdos, platform shoes, and tailor-made suits. It was a culture shift, and I got pulled into it. And I ended up in prison at 19, right? Now I'm in this prison, and there was some conditions brewing. I got there that end of May, right before my birthday, and a riot broke off, and 3 guards got killed. And they put the joint on lockdown. The governor came that night, and he said they expected this rebellion a year ago because this prison was designed to house 600 inmates. But on the day of the rebellion, there was over 2,000 inmates. Even the officers that worked there were complaining about the conditions they had to work under. There was tension between the officers and the administration, the officers and the inmates, and inmates and inmates. And this rebellion broke off, right? And then they came and they grabbed me, said I was on an institution transfer. I was like, thank God I'm escaping this here. But when I got on that bus, and I saw every gang leader that was in that prison on that bus, myself, Smokey Hill, Larry Hoover, Prince Danke, all them guys, I said, we it. And they transferred to Stateville Maximum Security Prison, and they housed us on death row. And 79 rolled around March, and they indicted us. And they charged each one of us with 15 counts of murder, 2 attempt murder, mob action. And the most frightening thing was when I went in front of the judge and said, you need a lawyer. I said, look, man, I've been locked up about 5 years now. I ain't got no attorney. He said, you need one because the state is seeking the death penalty. And the first thing that come to my mind was, I need to call my mama. And some of you brothers know what I'm talking about when it comes to some real stuff. You want mama. I need to call my mama. But what really was frightening in the courtroom because of my limited education, I didn't understand the dialogue that was going on because a lot of the language in courts is Latin, see. But as God have it, we all got acquitted on that case. I came out, I was 27, ill prepared to function back into society. I wasn't ready. Brothers, the Jet magazine did an article on us, newspaper, gang leader returned home, right? Guys waiting on me. I got the city in my hand. I run the mob. I wasn't ready for this. Guys taking me around, sweating these drug dealers. They giving me ounces of syrup and gallons of syrup and dope and all this stuff. I ain't never sold a bag of dope in my life. 4 months later, I was back in prison. Did 3 more calendars down there. And that's what my life changed. I remember a lot of young guys coming down. These were the sons of girls I went to grammar school with. And they called home and told their mamas they met me. And their mamas would call me to the phone and say, Benny Lee, look out for my baby. Their grandmamas would call, say, Benny Lee, I used to let you sit on my porch when you used to run from the police. Look out for my baby, right? And so I tell these little guys, look, man, as vice lords, we got an oath we took that we would serve our time constructively so that upon our release, we become a more productive member of our community. So if you don't have a high school diploma, you need to enroll in school. If you have one, you need to take up a trade. Them little guys bucked, say they ain't gonna do it. I said, I tell you what, that name you carrying, that's my name. I could take it from you. So they tried to apply. But what we found that in Stateville Maximum Security Penitentiary, this is in 1982, there was a slot for 80 people to go to school, and there was over 2,000 inmates in that prison. So we tried to talk to the administration, they didn't want to budge. So I said, I tell you what, don't no vice lord mop a floor, sweep a kitchen, work in the kitchen, we're going to withdraw our labor. And so Lord Gino, who ran all the Latin kings, said, well, ain't no king's going to do it. Then Larry Hoover said, ain't no GD's going to do it. So we withdrew our labor. They had to bring officers from other prisons to cook for us or clean up behind us. And we tell our guys, don't agitate these police, let them do their job. Right? Now the warden want to talk. I said, no, we ain't going to go in no administration building and talk and you work out a deal and get these brothers to think we done sold them out. We're going to talk right here. We had a town hall meeting in the cell house. And I told the warden, I said, look, man, we all come from these communities that are social disorganized and marginalized communities. We have limited education opportunities and employment opportunities, and this is why a lot of us here in prison. And now here we are in this prison with over 2,000 inmates. You only got a job for only 110 people and a slot for 80 people to go to school. We leaving here ill-prepared to function out there. That's why we recidivate and come back here. And 2 days later, he threw me in segregation, said I was potentially about to cite a riot. Because I had a jacket. I've been in 3 prison riots by that time. Rebellions, fighting conditions. And they threw him in a cell. And the guy that was there before me left. Malcolm X autobiography on the bunk. I'd heard of Malcolm X, but I didn't know too much about him. And so out of boredom, after being in SEG for about 3 months, I picked that book up and turned right to the page where Malcolm X was frustrated because he couldn't comprehend what he was reading. And he put the text down and picked up a dictionary and studied it from A to Z. And I hollered down the gallery, who got a dictionary? I started studying the dictionary. Then the brother said, hey, man, check this out. And he gave me Chain and Images of Psychological Slavery by Dr. Naeem Akbar. Then another brother gave me The Miseducation of the Negro by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So when I come out of SEG, I had a different psychology. I started seeing myself different. I started seeing the world different. I started seeing myself functioning in the world different. And I told my mob, I said, look, man, we're saying we're an organization, but we're acting like a gang. We need to change how we do things. But the older guys, they still wanted to shank these little brothers up, put them on security and all that. I said, look, man, I would die down here before I let this generation go through what we've been through. We done spent all our 20s behind this wall. We owe it to them, right? But I ran into opposition with my own mom. I said, you know what, Jack? I ain't with it no more. I'm bagging up. But See, I wasn't no jailhouse hookup. I was a chief from the streets. I had a mob. And they thought I was saying we stepping away from the nation. I said, no, I'm stepping away from everything. So for 3 months in prison, I was a neutron. No rank, no juice, right? Vulnerable, but I had allies. You know, Larry Hoover, he like, man, I got you. I said, man, I got to walk this alone because I got to go home. This is between me and these guys. So when I came out, I was a whole different person. And because in the 70s, I was a heroin addict. My last case, one of them fluke cases, coming down the strip, some little guys ran out of a store. As I walked up, the police pulled up and locked me up for attempt burglary. That was God's intervention, in the police station doing a budget plan on a piece of bubble gum because I don't eat pork. A heroin addict with a diet, right? So I go in the jail, right? Brothers hear them in the jail. They have gang meetings in the chapel. They heard I was in the jail. I was like, man, tell them studs I ain't with that. So I was in the cell with a guy. He had got mandated to drug treatment. I had never heard of treatment. I thought treatment meant you couldn't handle your high and you went crazy and they sent you to the crazy house, right? So he got to explain that treatment to me, right? And we talked about when our homies had got treatment, got married, worked a job, moving in Wisconsin. That's out of heard of for the crowd I come from. Right? How many of y'all know there ain't no rules in a crowd that don't play fair? That's the crowd I come from, right? And so the newcomer in, I see this guy dragging a blanket. I said, man, that look just like little Larry. The guy we talking about. I said, what happened? He said, I relapsed. I'm thinking, went crazy again or whatever. I don't understand relapse. So I'm telling him, I said, yeah, man, I got this temp burger. I might can get a tray ball. You did, 3 years. I might can touch down, and when I hit back, I can catch up with the dog races in Arkansas. Then I can follow the Cool Jazz Fest in Cincinnati, and then the Mardi Gras. And he said, man, you talking your way back in the joint before you even get out. And that's the first time I've ever heard this term called a vicious cycle. He said, man, go to that front of that judge, tell me you're a drug addict, and they can mandate you to treatment. And I went in there and I had the public defender file this motion. The state's attorney went through the roof. Y'all, this man's a known gang leader. He's been charged with gang racketeering, kidnapping, murder, I said, oh, Lord, I ain't going to get the program this morning. But Judge Moran asked me, he said, Mr. Lee, why should I give you the program? I said, Your Honor, because it's cold outside, and I don't have a coat. And if you let me go this morning, I'm going to be forced to go somewhere and take a coat. I've been to prison on 3 different occasions, and I believe if I got this program, I might have a chance. In spite of my background, Judge Moran mandated me to long-term treatment. And I walked out the county jail November 15, 1984, 38 years ago, and I ain't been back since. And the real work kicked in. That's me and my sister when I was on death row. She come to visit me, bless her heart, stayed in my corner. Ain't nothing like a sister. And that's just a clipping of when we got freed from the rebellion down in Pontiac, right? And that's my first organization I started. So now here I am in long-term treatment. And back then, there was a mandatory minimum of 18 months. Then you can go to second phase where you go find a job and all that. And when I got to that phase, they said, you got to put a resume together. I never heard of a resume because I had never worked. I was 32 years old, never had a Social Security card ever, never had a driver's license, never worked at 32, right? And they say, well, you need to put a resume together. The only thing I could put on there was my name, and it was a blank sheet. Because the part where it said career objectives, I left that blank because I didn't have a career, didn't even know what objectives mean. It said work history, I had to leave that blank because I ain't never had a paper route, right? Then it said educational background, I had to leave that blank as far as I went to school for 3 months as a freshman at Austin High School before I got shipped to St. Charles, right? So I'm looking at this piece of paper, and the message I got was, who gonna hire me? This was my belief system. But then I met with some brothers, these support groups I was going through, and they said, Benny Lee, as long as you believe you can't get a job because your background, your motivation to seek employment is going to be real low. and you're setting yourself up to go back to hustling. Because, see, I had more confidence in my hustling skills than I did in working a job at that time. I was faced with this ambivalence. A part of me wanted to stay out, but then a part of me knew I had to go back. What I know how I can get some money was hustling. So I had to kill a part of that ambivalence off. And so they gave me a new belief system, and they showed me the strategies they used, because these guys was in the joint with me, and they was working. They had apartments, right? And so they cocked me a resume, say I was a self-starter, highly motivated, all that stuff there. And then they told me put on a white shirt with a black tie, and I'm stepping out in public at the bus stop with this white shirt on, this black tie with this resume up under my arm, feeling like Ike Nickelback or somebody, because now I'm dressed like a Vic. Seem like everybody passing me looking like I'm an easy prey, like I'm a lame. I want to take this tie off and say, man, I ain't with this. I'm talking about these psychological blocking agents that you face when you're making this transformation, right? But going to these support networks, they gave me what I needed. This became my matrix. And what is a matrix? A matrix offers three things. One, it's a safe place. It's a place of nurturing the energy, and it's a place to explore future possibilities. So these support groups became my matrix, right? And you know how hard it was for me to just pay my bus fare and just sit down, right? Because when I got on buses, I picked pockets. I might be in the back playing them 3 cards at Molly or the 3 tops with the ball. You know, I was Poe George. You know, all you good folks turn on around. You got to find about the baddest game ever hit this town. Each and every time, turn to one red car in the center, says you're going to be a winner. 2 blacks say you can't get your money back. Those you ain't betting, you got to step back, right? So that's who I was. So it was hard for me just to pay my bus fare and just sit down and watch all these gifts just walk past me. That's trauma. And see, it's hard trying to be a citizen because citizens obey the law. I broke the law every day. I couldn't even get in a crap game right. I had to get in a crap game, had to have a pitcher to the squares, some 8 straight flies, 6-8 flats, miss out, dead deuces, a scoop shot, Texas turned. I cheated. When I went to the store, I shortchanged the cashier. You need small bills count that, make sure that's it, right? Everywhere I went, I broke the law. So now I'm trying to cross this line to become a citizen. And not to mention 32 sitting in a GED class learning how to do fractions and multiplication. And these young kids, 18, 19 years old, laughing at the questions I'm asking, calling me pops. Right? I want to hit one of these little marks in the eye, but I don't want to get put out the class. Fighting for my life. Then working this mediocre job, $4.25 an hour at a warehouse out in Rosemont, Illinois, in a suburb. And everybody in there stealing out the warehouse and getting high on their lunch break. I'm on parole trying to complete treatment, right? And every now and then they telling me to get up on the stand. I'm like, no, man, sneeze me, I ain't with all that. Right now the room in the warehouse is I'm a stool pigeon. I got these thoughts. Maybe I need to take one of them in the back of the truck and bang them up right quick and grab me two of these table legs and, man, let me tell y'all who I really am. But I didn't want to lose this little $4.25 hour job. Fighting for my life. But these guys suggested, man, why don't you do some volunteer work at this adolescent drug program? It was called Comp Care. This is in 1986. I just got my GED. Right? And one of the nurses approached me and said, hey, we got a psychiatric technician position open. Why don't you go for it? And my man ain't qualified to be no psychiatric technician. She said, no, it's a milieu tech. Make sure they don't run through the hallways and go to groups. I said, okay, I can do that. And they hired me. October 86 rolled around. I completed parole, all my mandates, and then my task case manager said, hey, they got an entry-level drug counselor position up in Evanston, Illinois. Why don't you go for it? In my mind, Evanston is a rich white suburb. They're going to lock me up as soon as I get off the L train. I'm talking about these psychological blocking agents that we struggle with. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois called it a double conscience in his writing, The Soul of Black Folks. You know, how I see myself as a black man, how I believe society view me, right? But they urged me, go up there. And I went up there and they hired me. But my struggle was sitting in these staff meetings discussing these cases, and they using all these clinical terminologies. This client struggled with maladaptive behavior, and this one has impaired social skills. In my mind, I want to say something. You know, all that mom got to do is bust that out of his game, he can be straight. But you can't use slang in a professional setting. I would leave work every day feeling so incompetent, so inferior, giving myself this message, I don't belong here. But where can I go? Back in this box I've been in all my life. And in the box, you got high school dropouts, you got gang members, you got drug addicts, drug dealers, hookers, thieves, and now here I am outside the box with people speaking with good diction, pursuing careers, and I'm feeling so inferior, I'm ready to go back in my box. But because I built relationships through these support groups, brothers noticed a change in my mood, and I had to get honest. And I told them what I was struggling with. I said, well, why don't you enroll in school? And I enrolled in school. I took enough classes to pass the state board exam and became a certified drug abuse counselor. Yeah. Then they moved me up to a senior counselor. Then I left that agency. I went back and I got an associate's degree in mental health and substance abuse. And my challenge was sitting in these meetings and we would discuss these cases. One little guy, he went home on a weekend pass and he came back with his hair twisted. The staff jumped all over him because it's a predominantly white community, predominantly white staff, all this. Not knowing then how to treat a person in a cultural context. And I'm trying to speak up and say, well, I think it's a good thing for him to do that. Because most young black guys struggle with cultural shame because the image they've been given about themselves. He's seeking some cultural identity that might help his esteem. They laughed at me. Boy, I fought so hard not to turn that table over and grab me two of these chairs and bust the director upside her head, right? But I took that deep breath and asked her, could I have an audience with her? And I explained to her, more of these black guys that's coming in here. And the staff needs some cultural sensitivity training, how to treat these clients from a cultural context. That goes with the Hispanics, the blacks, even the poor white, right? And she said, well, why don't you do a training to the staff? I never did a training in my life. But I did it. Well, I got the quote in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, a theory I knew they knew. Then I brought a little Dr. Naim Akbar, Chain of Images of Psychological Slavery in there. Then I came with Piaget and Gestalt and Rogers and all them because I knew they knew that language. And then I added a little Dr. Amos Wilson, right, the developmental stage of black child, right? And then they had a conference with all the counselors in Illinois. And I had the audacity to put in for a call for papers to be a trainer at that conference. And they accepted it because my title was, How Do You Treat the African-American Gang-Affiliated Substance Abuser? And they said, you need a handout for 20 people. About a week before the conference, they said, well, you need about 80. The day of the conference, they said, well, we putting you in the grand ballroom because over 300 people want to come to your workshop. And I got nervous. And I looked out with all the 300-some people there. Most of them were old white guys with no expression on their face, got these PhDs and doctorate degrees, executive directors of the program. And I was scared because all I had was a GED. And that's this sister, Robbie. She said, baby, look, they come to hear you. Treat them like they're your clients and teach them. And that's all I needed. And I went out there and I broke down these different theories, right? And after it was over with, I got 3 contracts. People want me to come and train their staff because I designed this model. I met with 10 guys that had been to joint with me, was in this substance abuse, that went through treatment, and we came up with this model. How do you treat the African-American gang-affiliated substance abuse? And then later on, you know, they was discharging people out of treatment that came because they was from the criminal justice system. I ended up getting a promotion at an agency. It was the first of its kind. All the clients were convicted felons that had drug problems. In fact, the judges from Texas came to Chicago to meet with our judges to learn that model. How do you as a judge, mandate people to treatment and all that. And I think it was in Wilmer, Texas, they opened up that facility, and I came to train them on how to set up a therapeutic community for criminal justice substance abusers. You know, because they have these 7 cardinal rules that if you violate, you automatically get terminated. I said, well, you know, if we live by that, then we might as well close our doors and say we don't work with this population, because these are the issues they come with, right? So I was able to move up in substance abuse, and then I remember our Governor Blagojevich, he noticed that, you know, in Illinois, over 70% of the people in prison been there before. A lot of new people ain't going to prison. It's the same people, right? And 60% of the people in the Illinois prison system come from 6 neighborhoods in Chicago, and they returning, right? And so they approached me and asked me would I be willing to work there. I said, I ain't trying to work in no prison, right? Then they said, well, meet us at the State Building. And they gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. So they hired me as the community liaison for all the prisons in Illinois that had substance abuse issues in there, all right? And so now some of the work, because I know I'm running out of time, this is my organization, NAFI, National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Formerly Incarcerated, and how we came about. Those are just some of the brothers at one of our conventions we have, right? I called a meeting, and about 47 convicted felons showed, and 12 of them was women. And I confronted them and said, man, we're the most passive group in this country. We complain about what we can't do as convicted felons, but yet we're not in the fight on our own behalf. You know, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, but it didn't pass Congress until 1865. And it gave birth to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution that says no person of U.S. citizenship should be subject to slavery or indentured servitude unless otherwise convicted of a crime. So that put us in the state of slaves, 3/5 citizenship. See, I've been out of prison 38 years, but I still can't become a licensed real estate broker. I can't sell insurance. There's over 180 licenses I can't even apply for in Illinois because of my conviction, right? I came down here to try to help my son get an apartment. You guys' laws say if you got a misdemeanor, you can't even apply for an apartment until after 5 years of that misdemeanor. 10 if it's a felony. These are social disabilities to disabled people. This is one of our, well, pass it up. One of our community events in my community on the west side where I come from, me and some of the OGs, we decided to go back to where we come from in the 60s to bring down the violence in our community. Because my premise was that if we can get these brothers to talk to each other, it'll be hard for them to shoot each other. Because see, the social media is the #1 enemy. Because see, back in my days, if I got an issue with Chico, somebody might get to Chico and say, well, I know Benny Lee, man, let me holler at him. They might get to me and say, man, I know Chico, man, let me holler at him. By the time we do see each other, that tension done kind of seized a little bit, and we probably can work it through. But today, these little guys commit themselves on social media, and they build it up. These are Facebook gangsters. And when they finally see each other, ain't no turning back. Now we got to do it, see? And so we decided we'll do that, right? And this, what we did on the west side of Chicago, we formed the West Side Coalition, right? These are nonprofit organizations pretty much headed up by formerly incarcerated and convicted people. I'm a CEO of mine, 501c3. You know, Akeem Berry, a former Folk Corner hustler, did 19 years on TAM. He got Saving Our Sons, right? You know, then we got the West Side branch of the NAACP is our fiscal agent. Because we were smart enough to know that if one of us go for it, they might deny us. So we put the NAACP up front to be the lead agency, and we became those agencies that come together, collaborate to address that. And that's just a picture of us on that front row, different members of the coalition. right? And this is a demonstration we had about 2 weeks ago, marching down. It was a peace march, a peace and justice summit and march that we had. That was about 2 weeks ago. And then Chicago formed this through the Metropolitan Family Service, right? And you'll hear from some of them like Bo Deal and Hot Rod right there. They some of the lead trainers and field marshals out there. Am I saying that right? Field managers, right? Because these brothers got credibility, right? And they do that work, right? And then brother Chico Tillman, he's done some of that work too, and then rose up to become Dr. Chico Tillman. Right? He say I'm his mentor, but it's done reversed. Yeah, he used to be one of my students in one of the classes I teach at Northeastern, but now he done rose above, but he's still humble, right? And so we got Community Partner for Peace, right? These are just some of the organizations that's part of Community Partner for Peace, headed up by T.O. Hardeman, that used to be the director of Ceasefire. Now he's got his own organization, Violence Interrupters, and then me there, but top left corner doing a training at the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago. Then you got UCAN, they do that work also. And then this is Martin Luther King's. He didn't come up with that model, the beloved community, but he one that made it popular, right? And he just believed that we cannot build a beloved community until we rid society of three triple evils, poverty, racism, and militarism. It was in the 60s when police officers didn't know how to handle those crowds with the rioting and demonstration that was going on with those movements in the 60s. With the convention, the Chicago Convention, where they locked up Bobby Seals or the Black Panthers and all that, right? And so military personnel came and trained police officers how to deal with that. And at that point, police officers, at least in Chicago, have taken on these military tactics to deal with our communities and have our community under siege with the stop and frisk and all that. And that's aggravating, when you just a regular young boy home from college and you get pulled over because they say you look like you gang affiliate. And then if you with a cousin, as probably is, they put you in the gang book, right? And now when you coming out of high school, you can't go to the college you want to because they got you labeled in a gang book, and you're really not. So a lot of that, what Martin Luther King taught, we got to attack the forces of evil, not the people doing the evil, these systems, right? And that beloved community has got different levels to it, You get one responsibility is to educate. What should people be educated on? And then how do people sustain themselves? How do they console themselves? And then how do you celebrate? But then there's three levels. It begins with self first. And then it begins with relationships and then with community. So what should I be educated on? One, I need to be educated on the laws when it comes to convicted felons, right? Because my whole thing is, when do my wrong end and my rights begin? That's a question America needs to ask. Now, I was able to testify at a congressional hearing in Congress maybe about 4 years ago, and I challenged Congress. You saying I done paid my debt to society, but then again, the Second Amendment said that all citizens got a right to bear arms. But because of my conviction, I can't even get a Ford card, right? A landlord can legally say he can't rent me an apartment because of my background. But you saying I paid my debt to society? The debt is a myth. Congress needs to put the debt in writing. When does my wrong end and my rights begin? See? So there's certain things I'm limited. I have 3/5 citizenship, 38 years later, right? So this beloved community, is based on those three levels. It began with self first, then the relationships you in. It could be co-workers, family, whatever. Then it goes into the community. What should the community be educated on, right? What should family, relationships should be educated on? How do we sustain ourselves to hold on to the things that's been working? And how do we console ourselves when something happened among us? Because we go through a lot of trauma, a lot of pain. Are we set up as community to console each other in community? Are we set up as co-workers and family members to console each other? And then how do we celebrate, right? So now, Martin Luther King got these 6 Let me put my eyeglass back on. Ain't that something when you get old, you got to wear principles of nonviolence, right? The first principle is nonviolence is a way of life of courageous people, not cowards. And Martin King said, okay, if we go march, we're going to demonstrate, we may get killed, we may go to jail, we might get spit upon, we might get threatened, but if you ain't got the courage to go address that unjust situation in spite of those conditions, then you need to go home. Because nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people, not cowards, right? Then the second one, build a beloved community wherever you go. Wherever I go, when I walk in a gas station, 3 and 4 young guys blocking the doorway, and I, excuse me, brother, let me by. They look at me very intimidated, and they stir up an old gangster inside me. I want to smack one of you little mouth, but I can't do that, right? Because I got to build a beloved community wherever I go. Yeah. Principle 3, attack the force of evil, not the person doing the evil. It's these systems, you've heard of that school to prison pipeline. Little kids get into a fight because they come to school traumatized. Probably done heard their mama boyfriend jumped on it that night. Somebody outside done killed somebody. They bring that to school, and first time when they peers say something, trigger something, that they get into a fight, and they taken off by the police to the station. That's a traumatic experience for a child whose brain haven't been developed yet. That making some sense? He giving me the whoop whoop sign. All right? And the fourth principle is suffering without retaliation for the sake of the just cause. Right? And then there's these steps of nonviolence. Right? You got to get your information, get your facts together. And your second step is you got to educate others on those issues. And then third, you got to be committed to follow this through in a nonviolent way and not look at your opposer as an enemy, right? And then you got to sit down and negotiate. But you got to negotiate with the facts, looking at some projected outcomes. And if negotiation fails, then you take direct action. And then that brings light on a broader community to see it. Then you come back to the negotiation table. And then you reconcile, right? So he done gave me the whoop whoop sign, but I want to say thanks for having me out here, all right? I don't know if that means I had 5 minutes or 2 minutes or just wrap it up right now. But I'm going to say right quick, how do you go back? Well, I'm moving too fast. Well, anyway.
We want to open it up for questions. One question, because we do have a powerful, powerful presentation, but we have other speakers that we also want to get to. So I'm going to open it up to the room to ask if there's one question for Mr. Benny. So a lot of pressure, make it a good one. Don't be scared. I didn't mean to intimidate y'all. One question for Mr. Benny. All right, here we go.
Give that sister a hand for having the courage in front of all these people.
Thank you for a very informative talk, Mr. Lee. Would you tell us what we should be doing now with our young people who we would say are at risk?
Well, I wish my son was here. My son moved down here about 7 years ago from Chicago. He had a high-ranking position with a street organization, and he realized the way he was living, if he stayed in Chicago, he might not live to see his son grow up. So he decided to come down here. And he knows the mindset of these young, because we're dealing with the mindset. Right? We're dealing with how do people respond to trauma? How do people respond to poverty? How do people respond to fear? Because young people hearing about violence have a fear that they may be victimized of violence, so they start premeditating means of dealing with it if it come their way. So they train to be violent against their will. And having young people like my son and these young guys that moved out that era of gang banging and all that stuff, They need to be back in these schools sharing their experiences, how they got out of it, and the do's and don'ts. And when you come together to create programs, they need to be at the table. Because that's a missing link that's not at the table. These young people, these are real, credible messengers that can tell you, this is what I was up against, but this is how I got out. And they can be a message to that young guy that's struggling, that's out there trying to carry. Because see, just like most of you carry guns for protection, these young guys carry guns for the same reason. Because they the number one targets of their peers. They shooting each other, right? So we got to start inviting the real people, the people that's really affected by this violent issue to the table to talk about what got you away from that way of thinking. How are you holding on to sustain what you done accomplished and not go back, right? And then young people, because they come from the neighborhood. And trust me, like my son came down here, his whole crew mostly done turned their lives around because he detached. And he's coming back every now and then, tell me I work at a hospital now. I'm doing this here now. And so they done turned their life. So that influence, and then the collaboration, knowing your hyper-local, what's in the area. But is everybody trained on, cross-training? Is everybody trained and see the situation the same? Is there a collaboration? The police got its role. The clergy got their role. The social services got their role, right? The street outreach workers got their role, right? So everybody should be in the same room. I'm gonna say this and shut up. We had a training, last year, was that Chico, we was up in Kenosha. I did a nonviolence training where we had the chief of police and police officers in the same training with the community activists and former gang members, getting the same message and coming to an agreement. This is how we move forward, right? This is building beloved community, right? Bringing the community in. And there's the gangbanger, the prostitute, the drug addict, the high school dropout, the college graduate, the mother, the deadbeat dad, all that make up community. No one should be excluded. We all should be at the table sharing our issues, but learning how to ask for what we need. Right? And I believe those of us that do this week should be trained on the culture, should be trained on the dynamics. I mean, how are you going to help me as a social worker and I show up and you don't know if I'm on parole or probation, if I'm part of the judicial system or the penal system? If you don't understand that, how can you begin to even move me forward? Do you know the laws? Do you know the incentives in this state that help guys like me, where companies can take a risk on me? Is there things been passed, like in Illinois, you can earn a medical disability waiver? Well, hospitals normally don't hire convicted felons, but with that waiver, they will. Can you get a certificate of good conduct from the state with the governor's signature on it, saying we recognize this person in good standards with the state? All those things to give you a heads up, right? Because when they see us, y'all seen that, the 5 brothers out of Central Park in New York? When they see us, what do they see? We got to change that narrative, and it can be changed through our young people that's doing something, and they get more highlighted than the ones we see on the news that's getting locked up. We need to put those success stories more out there. And trust me, some little guy that's struggling, trying to get out, see that and say, I know dude. I was in the joint with him. I was locked up with him. And he's doing that. That give him some hope. So we got to expose the good and stop hiding it and then not allowing them at the table. I don't know if I answered your question or not. That's it?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed lunch. I have the honor of introducing our next guest presenter. Well, before I do that, I would like to thank Bennett Lee for his powerful presentation. I want to applaud his strength, his perseverance, and also his willingness to give back to his community. Sometimes when we make it out of our issue, sometimes we forget where we come from. And he obviously did not forget where he came from. So thank you, sir, for your presentation. It was very powerful. So my name is Perry Turner. I am the Deputy County Administrator for Justice and Safety here in Harris County. In my previous role, which I'm kind of glad I'm teeing up this topic, I served as the Special Agent in charge of the Houston FBI Field Office for the past 7 years. And so during my tenure in Houston, I oversaw several active shooter investigations, one in Santa Fe, one in Corpus Christi, also 2 package bomb investigations, one in Austin, Texas, one in Beaumont, Texas, and also my old office assisted other field offices in Walmart active shooter in El Paso, and also the Sulphur Springs shooting in Sulphur Springs, Texas. So I really believe that in order for us to get our handle around these threats that are constantly changing around violent crimes, it takes a whole of society approach. So Bennett Lee is correct. It's going to take law enforcement, mental health professionals, doctors, and more importantly, folks in this room, and also support from the communities that we serve. So we need your help, and I look forward to working with you. So my role is to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jeff Temple. Dr. Temple is a professor, a licensed psychologist, and the Vice Dean for Research and Scholarship for the School of Nursing at the University of Texas Medical Branch, where he also holds the John Seeley Distinguished Chair in Community Health. As the founding director of the Center for Violence Prevention, his research focuses on prevention of interpersonal and community violence, including firearms violence. I also learned that he currently resides in Galveston County, but he was born and raised in California, Compton, California. So, but today, Dr. Temple is here to speak about gun violence in Harris County, Americans' gun proliferation, and the epidemic of mass shootings. Please welcome and receive Dr. Jeff R. Temple.
Thanks, bro. Yeah, I bet you weren't expecting me to come out from Compton. All right, so I had a bet with Mr. Turner that I could get everyone in here to cheer with only 2 words. Go Astros. I'm actually a huge Rangers fan, but I want you all to like me. I then bet him that I could get half the room to boo and half the room to cheer by saying, go Cowboys. Only one cow? Come on. This is terrible. All right, I know we're talking about a serious subject, so now I have to segue into that, but I'll do a better job. All right, so you can see this picture up here. You may not be familiar with this. This was President Obama and the moment he found out about Sandy Hook, the shooting in Connecticut that killed 26 people, elementary school kids, sort of the first Uvalde in a sense. And you could tell how he was affected. And immediately thereafter, he started to loosen a lot of the research, sort of the requirements to where we weren't really allowed to do research on gun violence. We kind of were, but also they didn't give us any money, and if we did publish stuff on it, then we might not be able to get money for other stuff. So basically, he loosened that. And it so happened that we were doing a longitudinal study that started in 2010 in the Houston area where we recruited 1,000 kids, and we've been following them every single year since then, asking them questions about dating violence and substance use and mental health and risky sexual behavior. And then when Obama loosened our restrictions on research, we started to add questions on gun violence and access to guns and and who carries a gun and why do people carry a gun and how did they get a gun, and really basic stuff that we didn't know because we weren't really allowed to do research on guns and it wasn't funded. So now we had a funded study where we're able to look at guns, access, carriage, use, threatening, all that sort of stuff. And so since 2013, we're now 2022. For 10 years, we've been collecting this really cool data on firearm access and use. And when we were doing that, and one of the schools, by the way, you'll recognize as Santa Fe High School. That was one of the schools where we recruited folks for that study. And that hit home because, as Mr. Turner said, I live in Galveston. I was actually on the Galveston School Board at this time, and I worked about 200 feet from the shooter's mom at UTMB. I have since seen, as patients of mine, several people involved in the shooting, which actually brings up another point about shooting. You know, I think we often focus on the deaths, and they're terrible. You know, so Santa Fe resulted in 10 deaths. But the hundreds of lives that are affected by these mass shootings are really hard to believe. I mean, you look at medical examiners, funeral directors, officers, FBI, principals, teachers, families, friends, people in the community, and we see that. We see that community is affected, that we develop sort of this community PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So things like the Vegas shooting, which so tragically resulted in 50 deaths, most people don't know that it also resulted in 500 injuries. 500 injuries from that one day. So then you multiply that by 10, 15, 20, 100 of who's really affected by that one shooting. It happened also that on May 17th, 2018, I was in Austin testifying to the Texas House of Representatives about school safety and about our need to prevent violence and gun violence. On May 18th, 2018 is when this happened, when Santa Fe tragedy happened. After that, and I didn't notice this until I got here and looked at my slides, I'm wearing the same suit as I was in this, but you can see this, I don't know, does this have a pointer? Yeah, you see that's me right there. I was on the Governor Abbott's roundtable and on school safety and gun violence after the Santa Fe and after the Sutherland Springs tragedy, and it was a really good meeting. There were people on both sides of the gun control debate, everyone there really wanting to do something about gun violence, and some really good things came out of it. So after the tragedy, the governor put out a school safety report, and we have some really for Texas even, some really cool stuff that came out of it, like this program called T-Chat, which we do telehealth with rural areas and urban areas throughout Texas, to where if a kid is disturbed or something's going on, that they can talk to someone through telehealth and have 4 sessions before they if they need additional help, they help find them more services. We were planning to be in Uvalde, but we never got there because we have a shortage of service providers. That's another story. But, and I'm so glad we're not being recorded, I know we are, it became easier to hold and carry a gun after the roundtable, after Sutherland Springs, after Santa Fe. It became easier to carry a gun. It became easier to buy a gun. It became easier to use a gun after, not more difficult, easier. And we see after every major shooting, Uvalde including, El Paso, every major shooting, the sales of guns skyrocket. And let me go on to the next one. And this is scary, and the title itself is self-evident. We own a ridiculous number of guns. And when you really put it to focus, and by the way, I just want to get this out of the way. I am not anti-gun. I really am not. But the cause is guns. And we're going to go over this 100 different ways before I end. Some of you might hate me by the end of the talk, and I apologize, but we have too many damn guns in America. And you can see this right here. And it's access to guns. That's what it is. It's not mental health. It's not being raised by a single mom. It's not literacy. It's not violent video games or movies or TV or anything like that. Why is it not that? How am I so sure? Because every single one of our peer countries has the very similar rates of violence, of mental health problems, of single-parent households. What they don't have is ready access to guns. And so that's my shortcut to the end of the talk. But I'm not anti-gun. I'm anti-weapons of war. And we'll get to that here in a second as well. But you see, this is actually an underestimate too. We have 4% of the world's population, but 42% of the world's guns owned by civilians. It's probably more than that. We have now probably 420 million guns in America. So that's more than one gun per American. So, not surprisingly, we also lead the world in children dying by gun. So it's not even close. So these are the top 10 causes of death for children and adolescents. You see that number one on there for U.S. cause of death are guns. The closest country to us is Canada, in which it's number 5. But when you look at the numbers there, 48 kids died there. Terrible. Tragedy. It's their 5th leading cause of death. In America, we had 4,357 kids die by gun, homicide or suicide. 4,357. Look at Australia, which it doesn't even break into the top 10, had 10 deaths. You have probably, I don't know, a quarter, 20% of our population. So when you extrapolate that out, even in raw numbers, you're still looking at single or barely double digits. So it's a problem. It's not getting better. If you look at this data in the last several years, since 2000, we are the only country among our peer countries where the childhood firearm deaths has increased. In every other peer country, it has decreased. So, what can we do? Can we predict gun violence? Maybe, sort of, but not really. And I'm going to tell you why the not really part. So, we do have, when a mass shooting happens, we can look back and see what was linked in these mass shooters. We know that that there's oftentimes angry, oftentimes an isolated or lonely or alienated kid, emotionally unstable young man. And the last part is probably our best predictor, male. The second best predictor is white. It's typically a white male is what we see with mass shooting. I'm going to see if I can go back there. Yeah. So it's typically a white male, but there's a whole bunch of other characteristics, but that's not even that good. So the Secret Service did a nomothetic analysis where they looked at all the different things. How can we predict who will be a mass shooter? And they did find some stuff, like loneliness, like that. I guess it's on a timer, sorry. But when they look at it over and over again, and they look at the different types, it's, some kids, some mass shooters were popular. Some were loners. Some got good grades. Some got bad grades. Some were made fun of. Some, again, were football players. It's just really hard to identify who will be a school shooter. And then you look at this and you try to identify who's going to be the next school shooter. And you try to look at all those characteristics, and you realize that this represents a whole heck of a lot of people that if someone's controlling this, if they could turn off the timer, I don't really know how, so I appreciate that. You see that to predict it, the average proportion of U.S. males aged 15 to 44 commit a mass shooting a year, 1 in 13 million. And so really what I have lobbied for and what others have lobbied for, you can see this quote, it's one of my favorite quotes. We should not be looking for strategies to identify the next school shooter. We need to identify strategies to look for the kids who need help. Rather than identifying the needle in the haystack, our approach is universal primary prevention that affects the needle, but also the hay. It's really great words. Oh, that's who said it. It was me. But I do try to live by those words as well, is that we can't find the next school shooter. It's impossible. We cannot. And if we put too many resources into that, we're going to come up empty. What we need to do is to focus our money, focus our resources on universal prevention. And so what that looks like is schools doing school-wide socio-emotional learning programs or healthy relationship programs, and I'll get to one that we've tested here in a little while. But when they do this, right, so the arguments against it are pretty silly. It is too expensive to do, sure, but it's real expensive after a violent attack. It doesn't fit in how we want to educate our kids into school curricula, sure, maybe. But you know what? If I am, not able to form healthy relationships, if I'm not happy, if I'm not healthy, if I'm sad, if I'm depressed, if I'm anxious, if I don't know how to form friendships, well, I'm not going to be any good at math or English or writing or anything else. So my argument is if we want to create good students, we have to create healthy, happy students. And it can't just be assemblies, right? We can't do this red ribbon week where we do 1 week on something and then one class on something and one assembly and one invited talk here. We can't do that stuff. It has to be in the schools, a robust program that starts early on, that's age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, that's in elementary school, middle school, high school, post-high school. It has to be. And they might say, well, they're supposed to be getting that at home. Cool. Let's give them at home. And what's the worst case scenario by also getting it at school? Also getting it at church. So they learn twice or 3 times how to be a good, happy, healthy person. That's the worst case scenario. I'll take it, right? And this universal approach, the worst case scenario, let's do the best case scenario first. The best case scenario is that we prevent another Uvalde. The worst case scenario is that it results in healthier and happier kids. And if I'm talking to people who are, just don't care about kids, don't care about their mental health. I was going to make a political joke, but I'm going to stay away from it, but I bet you guys know what I was going to say. We can appeal to their wallets and say that it is fiscally responsible to prevent violence, to promote health. Because the more we invest in prevention, and y'all know this, the more we're going to save later on, the better students they're going to be, the better taxpayers they're going to be, and so it is fiscally responsible to promote health and prevent violence. All right, next thing about schools. This is huge for me as a big proponent of public schools. Both my kids came out of that. I, again, served on the Galveston School Board. Schools are absolutely safe. They are the safest environment for many of our kids. By far, the safest environment for so many of our kids. It might be the only place that they have a pro-social adult. It might be the only place that they feel safe. It is safe, and despite all the scares that we've had recently. Solution, and I saw a lot of police here, is not more police. I don't want to defund police, but it's not more police. We just know that. And we know that the more police we have in schools, that it's not going to stop mass shooters, because again, what are some of the characteristics of mass shooting? White male, typically. When we have extra police in schools, what ends up happening is the black and brown kids get ticketed and get arrested and get punished. We also know through our research that the presence of guns increases the risk of violence, no matter who has the gun. So there's that scare as well. It's also not, mental health is not the cause. This is a psychologist, is a big factor that I always talk about, and anytime I can is I discuss this. So people will say, well, how is mental health not the cause? Because a normal person wouldn't go into a school or to a Walmart or to a 4th of July parade and shoot it up. A normal person doesn't do that. They're right. A normal person doesn't do that. but that doesn't mean that it's mental illness. In fact, there's not one psychiatric diagnosis that would explain mass shooting, not one. Not one mental illness would explain mass shooting. Quite the contrary, actually. This was a piece that Time magazine picked up one of my tweets, so I had to put it up here. Is that when we look at it, people with mental illness are most at risk of being victimized by violence. And when you look at all the characteristics of violence in general, mental illness is only responsible for 4% of overall violence. It is things like anger, substance use, impulsivity, exposure to violence, poverty, childhood abuse. Those are the things that seem to predict violence, including mass shootings. It does not mental health. It is not mental illness. If you look at, most of the mass shootings, less than half had a diagnosable mental illness. And even then, you can't really blame it on depression or anxiety because there's millions of kids with depression and anxiety, so it's not that. And again, going back to what we know about peer countries, same amount of mental health, not the gun violence. Misogyny, that is a problem. And we see that with domestic violence. So what I term sort of everyday gun violence, that comes from a couple different places, gang violence and domestic violence. And we know that 350 Texan women were killed by their partners last year. We know you could open up the newspaper on any given day and see a dating violent or domestic violent relationship end in homicide or femicide. So we know that domestic violence is a contributor, a cause to everyday gun violence. But it's also a contributor or a cause to mass shootings. There's a really good study by Geller and colleagues that basically looked at all of the mass shootings by year by domestic violence, and over half have some sort of family violence component. I think it was the Uvalde shooter shot. Is that the one that? Now I'm getting confused. It happens so often. Shot his grandmother first. Was that the right one? Yeah. See. And there's all those type of stories. You could look at a lot of the mass shooters where they have a history of domestic violence. So it is rampant in not just everyday gun violence, but mass violence. And so is xenophobia and racism. We could look at Walmart, Buffalo, this scared of other people, xenophobic, misogynistic stuff. That is a huge contributor to mass shootings. So I gave this away earlier. Access to guns is the cause. We did a really cool study as part of that longitudinal study that I talked about, where we looked at access to guns and mental health symptoms. And we saw what is related to kids, or actually these were young adults, use of violence, use of guns. And not surprisingly, it was access to guns. But maybe perhaps a little more surprisingly, no symptoms of mental health were related to their use of guns, not one. So not depression, not anxiety, not substance use, not hostility, not anything. It was access to guns. And when I put this out there, there's a lot of pushback. Of course it's from very hardcore NRA folks saying, of course it's access to guns. What else would it be? And I was like, yeah, no, I agree. We're on the same page. Then I got death threats from them. That was fun. All right, so we do live in reality. What can be done? And I think how much more time do I have, someone? 5 minutes. That's not a lot of time. I shouldn't have asked. All right. So what can be done? I'll go through a little bit. A lot of it is legislative and advocating. The recent Safer Communities Act was huge. As a psychologist, love the money for mental health and all that. I will say that's going to do a lot for suicides. Probably not going to do much for everyday gun violence or mass shootings, the mental health stuff. Great, I love it. We need more of it. We're in a mental health crisis right now. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The last wave of COVID is going to be a mental health crisis. It's getting worse. We need all that money, but it's not going to do anything about everyday gun violence and mass shootings, except suicides. But the closing of the boyfriend loophole is huge. So for those who don't know, prior to this recent legislation, if you were married and that person got convicted of domestic violence, they are no longer allowed to purchase a gun. But dating partners were still allowed to. So there was this boyfriend loophole is what we called it. So you can be convicted of dating violence and still be allowed to purchase a gun. That has now stopped with the closing of the boyfriend loophole. Hugely important given the fact that about half of femicides, about half of partner violence is by dating partners. Also because we're getting married at later ages so that it's not going to kick in. So that's huge. Love it. We need to increase age to buy assault rifles. You may not know this. You cannot buy a pistol in Texas until you're 21. But guess what? You can buy an assault rifle when you're 18. How stupid is that? And I'm sorry if there's any politicians here, but it is just stupid. All right, thank you. All right, thank you. Yeah, right? It's dumb. Secure storage laws, hugely important. Let's hold parents accountable if they don't store their guns the appropriate way. And then increase federal funding to support violence research and strengthen the boyfriend loophole a little bit more. So right now, despite all that good stuff with the boyfriend loophole, after 5 years, they can give that dating violence, person convicted of dating violence, their right to buy a gun again. That should be, it should mimic the domestic violence law, which does not allow them that. We need to educate parents about guns and about, again, 400 million guns in America. We need to educate our kids. We need to educate parents that they're out there. It is a difficult conversation, but when our kids go over to a play date, we need to ask them if they have guns. And it's not that, I always ask family where my kids go about firearms. Do you have guns at home? Yes, we do. Great. Jimmy is curious and always getting into things. How are your firearms stored? And trust me, kids know how to find stuff. If my dad's 1970s Playboys are any indication, kids know how to find stuff. I'm going to talk really, really briefly about this because I would like to have a minute or so for a couple questions. The 4th program is something that I didn't develop it, but I have adopted it, and with folks like Carlton, who's in the audience, we've been working with the city of Houston, where we've been implementing 4th in Houston area. It stands for reading, writing, arithmetic. 4th stands for relationship. 2 of those don't start with R. Don't worry about it. But basically, it teaches kids how to be in relationships. It teaches them, does role plays in school, takes the place of a health class a whole semester, where they get instructions on how to be in a healthy relationship. We teach kids everything, right? We teach them English, math, how to dribble a basketball, how to play a musical instrument, how to write, all that stuff. But we don't teach them the one human foundational skill, how to be in a relationship, how to apologize to someone, how to break up with someone, how to solve conflict, how the conflict is healthy and a normal part of relationships. So how do kids learn? They learn from watching their friends who also suck at it. They learn from the media, which is terrible. They learn from trial and error. Maybe that's okay. They learn from their parents, which might be okay, but even well-meaning parents, they might get in an argument in front of their kids and then make up somewhere else. My wife hates me because I'm like, oh, we argued in front of them. We should make up in front of them. I'm an annoying psychologist and husband, and probably parent too. All right, so this is, we've tested it. I guess I skipped ahead, but it really focuses on what I like about 4th is it's not just one program that focuses on one thing, because we've been doing that historically. One program on bullying, one program on sexting, one program on sexual behavior, one program on violence, and one program on substance use, if I didn't already say that. That's a really inefficient, ineffective way to do it, especially in a school-based setting where they don't have resources. So what this does is it targets the shared risk and protective factors of multiple problem behaviors so that we can prevent a whole bunch of bad stuff while also promoting good stuff. So it's not just enough to not be in a bad relationship, to not be in a violent relationship. That's not what we want to do. We want to teach people how to be in a healthy, happy, loving relationship. And this is a study that we put out that shows it's effective. And this is my favorite saying: if you're going to do anything for a common man, you have to start before he becomes a man. And let's see how much you guys have learned from the first part with the Cowboys and the Astros. Ban assault weapons, ban weapons of war. That's lukewarm. That's lukewarm, but I'll take it. I'll take it. Hey, for real though, thank you all for being here. We're going to need everyone in our fight against gun violence. It's going to get worse before it gets better, and I hate being that person, but there's going to be more Uvaldes until we really do something. So if we're not going to ban assault weapons, and I get the argument against banning them, I understand, I really do. We do have to do some practical stuff. We have to increase the age to 21. You can't rent a car until you're 25. You can't rent a hotel room until you're 25. The brain doesn't stop developing until you're about 26. Why not have assault weapons be older until you get one? I'm all about practical solutions, despite the fact that I like to tout out conflicting statements. All right, thank you all very much.
And we do have time for a question. Does anyone have a question in the audience? I can bring the mic over to them. Right there in the back.
Yes.
Let me get to you.
I could repeat it if you say it.
On your graph, it said that 4% actually had depressive, actually showed symptomology. But is that actually clinically diagnosed, or just students, children, students, young adults experience? Does that include those experiencing depressive symptomology that aren't diagnosed?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So is it like a mental illness? Is it a diagnosable mental illness that explains the 4%, and maybe it might be skewed in that depressive ideology or symptomatology might be related to gun violence or something to that effect, right? Probably not, and I'll say this because of the people in this room, probably half of us have some sort of symptoms of depression, and so even if it was, I guess that there's no utility in it because we can't lock up half of the people in this room, and same for students, right? We know that if we look at a cross section of students, probably about 30% of them are going to have symptoms of depression. Probably 50% are going to have symptoms of some sort of mental health. And so from a utility practical perspective, it doesn't matter. And even if it does, even if that is something, it's going to fall out when we look at some of the other predictors, like loneliness, isolation, bullying to a certain extent. But even all those characteristics that I mentioned, they're still less than 50% predictive value of whether or not they predict mass shootings. So it's just really difficult, which is why I'll always lobby for universal prevention, where every kid gets not just how to not be violent, but how to be happy and healthy. Other questions? Yes, and I'll repeat it if you can yell it. Just what?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
They're just 4, right, for me. So it's distribution, right? Some of it's lobbying, some of it's geo, and some of it's stakeholders, right?
Yep.
And stock exchange. How do you get around that? Thank you.
How do you get around those 4 things that are related to gun? I don't know if you do, and this is it's going to take, and I'm probably not going to totally answer your question, I apologize, but it's going to take generational investments like we did with cancer and HIV and tobacco and what we recently did with COVID to put a dent in the gun problem. There is, like I said, already over 1 gun per American. So by, no matter ban them, whatever, it's not going to do anything for generations. Like, we're going to have this problem with us for a very long time. And knowing that reality, that's where we have to come in and start to do universal prevention, storage laws, red flag laws, and these things work. So red flag laws work. If you look at states that have implemented red flag laws before and after, we see that there are reductions in violence. There's reductions in gun violence. And same with some states have already enacted the boyfriend loophole law. Those states have less gun violence with dating relationships. If you look at the banning of assault weapons, in 1994, they were banned. In 2004, they were left to expire. The ban was left to expire. We saw an increase before and an increase after. It was a decrease during that 10 years. So I'm not just some, hippie liberal talking about guns. I'm looking at the actual data and the science. And what the data and science says is that we know how to predict it. It's going to be how to prevent gun violence, but it's going to take, again, generational investments. Most people in this audience will not see a time in our lives where there aren't school shootings. It's a fun way to end. Yeah, I guess one more question. Is that okay, Rahesh?
Yeah. Very last question. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to know, as a psychologist, how much effect do you think it may have if we start showing kids videos of bullets or tearing up the bodies? We're used to with drugs. This is your brain on drugs, and even with alcohol, with the liver and all that, or even making people that are purchasing guns watch a series of videos of what the bullets do to the body before they can purchase a gun. How would that affect them?
No, it's a really good question. It makes me think of the debate that's going on right now is, do we show the carnage after you're asking the same thing, right? Do we show the images, the carnage after the school shootings? Man, I don't know. It's for people, better psychologists than me. But it's, pictures help. The reason that we have child labor laws is because of images of kids working in horrendous conditions. So maybe it will take something like that. We know from Uvalde that they couldn't identify the kids from their faces because they didn't have any. So it was through DNA that they had to identify them. So maybe that is the trick. I don't know. It's scary that it has to be, but maybe that is one way that we can prevent gun violence, or to make meaningful legislations to prevent gun violence. Thank you all very much. I hope I didn't piss off too many people. Thank you.
Thank you. And our breakout sessions are starting in the next few minutes. If you could make your way to those rooms that you'd like to go to. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Jeff Temple.